1867, the United States bought 586,000 square miles of land for $7.2 million. That works out to roughly 2 cents per acre. For land that turned out to contain some of the largest oil reserves in North America, gold deposits that triggered the last great gold rush in American history, and a military position so strategically critical that Japan invaded it during World War II. The American press called it Seward's Folly. They called it Seward's Icebox. They called it War Russia. The man who negotiated the deal, Secretary of State William Seward, was publicly mocked as a fool who had spent millions of taxpayer dollars on a frozen wasteland at the edge of the world. He was not a fool. He was about 150 years ahead of everyone else in the room. And the country that sold it? Russia, which has spent the last century and a half watching the United States extract hundreds of billions of dollars in oil, gold, and military advantage from land it gave away for the price of a moderately large house. This is the story of the greatest real estate deal in American history, and why both sides of the transaction completely misunderstood what they were actually trading. To understand why Russia sold Alaska, you have to understand the position the Russian Empire was in during the 1860s, and the specific fear that was driving its foreign policy. Russia had controlled Alaska since the mid-1700s, when explorer Vitus Bering's expedition returned with sea otter pelts and stories of vast, untouched territory. The fur trade that followed was enormously profitable for decades, but by the 1860s, the sea otters had been hunted nearly to extinction. The economic case for holding Alaska had largely collapsed. What replaced it was a strategic problem. Russia had just lost the Crimean War, a catastrophic defeat against a British-led alliance that left the Russian Empire financially drained and deeply aware of its military vulnerabilities. Russia's primary rival was sitting right next door to Alaska. British Columbia was growing rapidly. British naval power in the Pacific was significant. Russian military planners ran the calculation and reached an uncomfortable conclusion. If war broke out again with Britain, Alaska could not be defended. Russia would lose it anyway and receive nothing in return. Tsar Alexander II made the decision: better to sell Alaska to the Americans, a rising power and a country that shared Russia's suspicion of British expansion, than to hand it to Britain for free in the next war. Russia would get cash, eliminate a liability, and strengthen a potential ally against its primary rival in a single transaction. It was cold strategic logic, and it made complete sense in 1867. What Russia could not have known was what was sitting underground. William Henry Seward was one of the most ambitious expansionists in American political history. As Secretary of State under both Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, he believed the United States was destined to control not just the continental landmass, but the entire Pacific Rim, Canada, Cuba, Hawaii, and the Arctic. Alaska was not an impulse purchase. It was the centerpiece of a decades-long strategic vision. When Russian Minister Edward de Stockel approached him in March 1867, Seward was so eager that the two men negotiated through the night. The treaty was signed at 4 a.m. on March 30th, 1867. Seward had been waiting years for this moment and was not willing to risk losing it to a night's sleep. The Senate ratified the treaty. The House, which still had to appropriate the $7.2 million, was less enthusiastic. Newspapers savaged Seward. The New York Tribune, then one of the most influential papers in the country, called the purchase a waste of money. Congressmen debated whether a frozen wilderness at the edge of the continent had any conceivable use to the United States. The answer came in stages, and each stage was more valuable than the last. The first vindication came in 1896. Gold was discovered in the Klondike region, triggering the last great gold rush in North American history. An estimated 100,000 prospectors flooded into Alaska and the Yukon. The economic activity generated was enormous, and it permanently transformed the Pacific Northwest. The critics who had mocked Seward went quiet. The second vindication came in 1942. Japan invaded and occupied two Aleutian islands, Attu and Kiska, marking the only seizure of American territory by a foreign power since the War of 1812. U.S. General Billy Mitchell had warned Congress in 1935, "I believe that in the future, whoever holds Alaska will hold the world. I think it is the most important strategic place in the world." He was right. The Aleutian Islands stretch 1,200 miles from mainland Alaska toward the Japanese home islands, forming a natural bridge across the northern Pacific. Without Alaska, the United States would have had no geographic buffer and no forward position in that theatre of the war. The third vindication came in 1968, when oil was discovered at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's North Slope, one of the largest oil fields ever found in North America. Alaska's oil and gas industry has since contributed more than $274 billion in revenue to the state alone. The oil and gas sector has funded up to 90% of Alaska's state government budget in peak years. The total economic value extracted from Alaska's natural resources since 1867 runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. America paid $7.2 million, 2 cents per acre, for all of that. Russia's calculation in 1867 was not irrational. It was simply based on incomplete information, the same incomplete information that almost everyone had at the time. No one knew about the oil. No one could have predicted the scale of the gold rush. The strategic value of the Aleutian chain in a future Pacific war was not yet conceivable. But the deeper mistake Russia made was selling to a nation that would grow into a global superpower, and giving that superpower a strategic position that directly borders Russian territory. Alaska and Russia are separated at their closest point by just 55 miles across the Bering Strait. During the Cold War, the two most powerful nuclear-armed nations on Earth were staring at each other across a stretch of water that a strong swimmer might theoretically cross. American missile defense systems, radar installations, and military bases in Alaska became central to US strategy against the Soviet Union, the successor state to the very empire that had sold the land. Russian nationalists have complained about the Alaska sale ever since. In polls taken in Russia, significant majorities have called it a historic mistake. Some Russian politicians have periodically raised the idea of disputing the sale, though these are not serious legal claims. They are expressions of regret. The regret is understandable. What Russia sold for $7.2 million now generates more than that in oil revenue alone every few weeks. The Alaska purchase is one of the clearest examples in history of the difference between the value of an asset and the perceived value of an asset. In 1867, Alaska looked like a frozen liability. The people mocking Seward were not stupid. They were working with the information they had. The fur trade was dying, the land was remote, and the strategic picture of the Pacific was nothing like what it would become. Seward's genius was not that he knew about the oil or the gold or the Aleutian Islands' military significance. He did not know those things. His genius was that he understood a principle that most people in his government did not. Territory at the edge of a growing empire is almost always worth more than it looks. Geography compounds. A nation that controls the high ground, whether in geopolitics or in business, tends to find uses for it that no one anticipated at the time of acquisition. America paid 2 cents per acre for Alaska in 1867. Russia called it a good deal. History called it the greatest land bargain ever made, and it took less than 30 years to prove them both wrong.